So welcome to this week's course on St. Paul and his letters. I'm glad some of you came. Thanks for your patience so far. What we're going to do these next few days is go over St. Paul, who he was, and talk about some of his letters. Your handouts cover the next 3 days. Now, are there people here taking intermediate credit for live class? Okay. So for those who are taking credit, there is a required assignment to get intermediate credit. And so it's on the last page of your handouts. It's just a little one-page thing that you'll submit to Eric Diedel. And if those of you online are watching, you can request the handouts from Eric. But it just has, you pick a question, and over the next few days, kind of take some things in and come up with a little brief write-up, and that will get you intermediate life credit. And I don't know of a deadline, but probably sometime in the next month so that he can get those back to you. So intermediate life credit, but it's open to anybody. But for those of you taking credit, that's important. And then what we'll do each day, if we have time at the end, we'll ask questions, and I'll try to find time, if not end of today, at least a chunk of time tomorrow or Wednesday and Thursday to answer questions. But instead of calling them out as we go on, just write them down, and I will get to every question you guys have at some point, usually at the end of the day. Okay? Well, then with that, let's get started. And hopefully you have a Bible. If not, there's some in the middle. Bring your own Bibles if you want the next two classes. Whatever translation you're comfortable with is fine. We'll talk about the translations when it applies. So first off, let's begin in prayer. So in the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit, amen. God our Father, we thank you for the love you have shown us most perfectly through Jesus Christ, coming and dying for us, but also in all the gifts that you give us every single day. Help us these next few days to learn from St. Paul and see the transformation that your grace had in his life. Help us to imitate that, and also help us to see how it is that Paul transformed the culture and the world by your grace and all that he did, and help us to do the same thing with our own lives, with those around us, and with our own culture and with the world. And I ask this in your name. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit. Amen. Oh, I'm sorry. I cut it off. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. And Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Amen. All right. So who was St. Paul? St. John Chrysostom wrote about St. Paul, and he says that St. Paul should lead every single person into a deeper communion with God and be able to read him and learn from him so that we can grow in our relationship. And John Chrysostom compared St. Paul to an iron that's put into fire. And he says, like an iron put into fire, the iron itself basically becomes heat. It's transformed because now not only is it heat, it can share that heat with others. And so with Paul, he becomes love, and he becomes Christ. And that way he's transformed, and then he can help share Christ with others. And St. Paul talks about this in Galatians chapter 2, verse 20. He says, it's no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. And so it's because he is totally transformed by Christ. It doesn't happen overnight, but throughout his life, he continues to strive for holiness, strive for perfection, and continue to cooperate with that grace to allow it to help him over time to be made perfect and be made a saint, which he is today. So hopefully we can learn to imitate that over these next few days. But to understand Paul and his writings, we really have to understand the context of everything that was happening at that time. St. Paul's letters are beautiful and deep, but they're also very commonly misunderstood. And particularly when it comes to different Christian denominations, a lot of Protestants take Romans to mean a lot of things that Paul didn't intend for it to mean. And so some of his other letters can also be misunderstood. So it's important to understand, who was Paul? Who are these communities he was writing to, and what really does he mean, and in that context of when he was writing. And from that we can really start to appreciate what it is he's teaching us. So we're going to start off by learning who was St. Paul and who are these communities that he writes to, and these communities of people that he met along the way. So when we ask who was St. Paul, we learn from a few places. In Philippians chapter 3, Galatians chapter 1, Acts chapter 21 and 22, and then a few other places. Those are the key things where we really learn some things about who St. Paul was. St. Paul tells us he was a zealous Pharisee. That's in his own words. So he was a Jew, and he was from the tribe of Benjamin. And he even writes that I was blameless in the eyes of the law. I was a faithful Jew, faithful to the Torah, which is the Mosaic law that the Jews held, and we'll talk about that a lot these next few days. He was also not only a Jew, but a Roman citizen, and he was from the city called Tarsus. He was a tent maker by trade. He was also very well educated. He studied the Torah and the Jewish laws in Jerusalem under the Rabbi Gamaliel, and he'll say, I sat at the feet of Gamaliel and studied under him. So that suggests to us he was very well educated. He was also very outspoken, and he defended God and the Jewish law relentlessly, even using violence when necessary. And we're going to see that particularly with the Christians, because initially they're going to be viewed as just a blasphemous Jewish sect. And so Paul will persecute them because he's relentlessly being faithful and zealous to God. And then he will learn that his zeal is misplaced. But initially we can see the personality of Paul and how he is acting to uphold and to be faithful to the Jewish law and to God. Because everything he did against the Christians was because he thought he was being faithful to God and what God wanted. Now, one of the things with, and those are the passages, one of the things with Paul, we have to also understand what the mindset of a first century Jew would have been, because Paul tells us he was blameless. He was a blameless Jew, very faithful. So the Jews at that time saw themselves as the covenant people of God. They were awaiting the Messiah. They had been awaiting the Messiah for hundreds and hundreds of years, and so they were waiting for the Messiah to come and to redeem them. They awaited vindication. They just knew this Messiah was going to come and vindicate them because they had been persecuted for so long. This Messiah was going to come and save them. Now, a lot of them thought that this Messiah was going to come in a way to be a ruler, a physical ruler in the world, to be like a king in the world. They didn't necessarily think it'd be a spiritual kingdom, so they were waiting for someone to come and conquer the Romans and conquer those who persecuted them, and they were awaiting that to happen. But from the beginning, when God made a covenant with them in the Old Testament, the Jews were called to be a light to the world. They were supposed to show the world who God was and how God called us all to live. They knew that was their mission. They also saw that it was their duty to honor God. They saw it was their duty to criticize anyone being disloyal to God. And they also believed that these pagans, the Gentiles, were polluting Israel because there was all this influence by the pagans and the pagan culture. So the Pharisees, that name means pure ones. So they saw themselves as being the most pure, upholding the law and really separating themselves from the Gentile world and the pagan world. So they saw themselves as being the pure ones. And they had some problems with the Sadducees, which is another sect of the Jewish people. But the Sadducees interacted more with the Gentile world and the pagans, and so the Pharisees called themselves the pure ones. They're separating themselves. Now, for the Jewish-Christian relations at this point in the first century, after Christ had died and risen, and the apostles start to preach and proclaim what had happened, the Jewish people saw the Christians as a blasphemous sect, because they could see their Jewish roots, but they were starting to veer off into this weird teaching. The Christians no longer followed the Mosaic law, the Torah. That was the key thing for a Jewish person, and now the Christians are saying you don't need to uphold this. The temple was the holiest place in the world because it was the dwelling place of God on earth, and now the Christians are saying the temple, you don't necessarily need to go and worship there. You don't need the animal sacrifices. You don't need that Jewish priesthood to offer these animals to God anymore. And to them, that was just shocking. But the most heinous of all were these Christians were talking about a man named Jesus, who was a man. He had flesh and bones, and he had been a crucified criminal, but these Christians are saying he was God. That was blasphemy. A man being called God, and not only that, a criminal who had been crucified. The most humiliating death, the most painful death, and now they're saying that's God. So the Jewish people were just outraged by the claims of the Christians. And so Paul was one of these Jewish people, outraged. And so he starts to attack the Christians to try to stop the spread of heresy, because he thinks the Christians are heretics. So he begins persecuting them. Now, our first encounter with Paul is going to be in Acts chapter 7, which we're going to turn to. And while you're turning to that, so his name is Saul and Paul, and most scholars believe, there's some debate as to whether or not his name was changed, but most scholars believe that he had two names. Because he was a Jew and a Roman citizen, that Saul was his Jewish name and that Paul was his Roman name. And so when we first meet him in Acts chapter 7, Luke, who wrote the book of Acts of the Apostles, he's going to refer to him as Saul. And so we'll see when he starts to be referring to as Paul later. But right now, it's Acts chapter 7. He's going to be referred to as Saul. So in Acts chapter 7, the first thing that we see happening is Stephen. We meet Stephen. Stephen was a deacon, and he was the first martyr of the church because he's the first one killed for being a Christian. And so we're going to first meet Saul at this event. And what Stephen is doing is Stephen is preaching and teaching, and he's saying that the temple is no longer the place of God because God is everywhere. Stephen says that animal sacrifices are no longer needed. The Pharisees, as I mentioned, the pure ones, Stephen is criticizing them and saying, you're stiff-necked people and you're spiritually uncircumcised, which is what Jesus had been telling them as well. And so Stephen will tell them, you persecuted the prophets, you're being unfaithful. And so the Jewish people are irate, and they end up stoning Stephen to death, and they kill him. And what we see is that there is a particular person witnessing this event, and that person is Saul, St. Paul. So we can look towards the end of chapter 7, in the area, verse 58, approximately. We're not going to read that passage, but the thing to note, it tells us that Saul is there. He's witnessing the event, and he's present, and he's consenting because he's not stopping it from happening, but there's something even more. The men who stoned Stephen were told, lay their garments at the feet of a man named Saul. That act of laying your garments at someone's feet indicates that person has authority, that he's actually the one authorizing what you're doing. So you can think of whenever Paul tells us that I sat at the feet of the Rabbi Gamal and learned. So you're a disciple when you sit at the feet of someone, and that whoever's feet you're sitting at is the authority figure. Same with Mary and Martha. If you remember, Mary sat at the feet of Jesus. And whoever's feet you're sitting at, that person has an authority role. And so by them laying their garments at Saul's feet, it suggests that he's not only consenting, he's authorizing it. Then the next thing we're going to see is after this happens, and in Acts chapter 8, verse 1, it tells us Saul was consenting, but as I discussed, laying his garments down means it also means he's authorizing it. But in Acts chapter 8, the second half of verse 1, and it says, and on that day a great persecution arose against the church in Jerusalem, and they were all scattered throughout the region except the apostles. So the Christians start to become persecuted, and they all start to scatter except the apostles. They're going to stay in the Judea region for a while. And then Acts chapter 8 verse 3, it says, but Saul laid waste to the church. He dragged off men and women and sent them to prison. So by telling us it's men and women, that tells us two things. One, women were active in the early church, but also it shows us Paul's ruthlessness, that he's not only stopping with the men and women are being persecuted and imprisoned by St. Paul. And so in Galatians chapter 1, verse 13, and we're not going to skip to that verse yet, but Paul even tells us, I persecuted the church violently, and I tried to destroy it. So Paul is definitely being very ruthless with early Christians. Now we're going to jump to chapter 9, verse 1. Acts chapter 9, verse 1. But Saul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest. And we're going to talk about why he goes to the high priest, but the first thing to note is it says that he's breathing threats and murder. So again tells us that he is consenting to murder. In Acts chapter 26, verse 10, St. Luke will tell us that Paul casted votes consenting to the murder of Christians. So we know that Paul is persecuting them, he's imprisoning them, and he's consenting to Christians being murdered for their faith. But Paul sees that he's being faithful to God, that he's being zealous, and that he is protecting God and his covenant people and God's laws. Saul doesn't yet see that it's misguided, so he thinks he's doing the right thing. And then in Acts chapter 9, so what Paul is doing, he's going to the high priest, and he's asking him in Acts chapter 9, verse 2, he's asking him for letters to go to the synagogues at Damascus. And so Damascus is north. Let me skip through these slides real quick. Damascus is north of Jerusalem, pretty far north. Damascus is an important area because it's a center of trade. And so between the east and the west and other parts of the empire, Damascus is an important location for those in Jerusalem. And if you recall, back in the Old Testament, whenever the Jewish people were captured by the Babylons and taken into exile, they went far to the east. And then when they were allowed to return to Jerusalem, some returned and then some stayed. Well, Damascus was a key trade route between those in the east and those who are now in Jerusalem. So Paul sees that if the Christians make it to Damascus and are successful, the faith is going to start to spread because that's an important trade route. So if he can get to Damascus and stop the Christians from spreading their faith there, he can stop it from spreading in other places. So Damascus is a key point of contact for Paul. So he wants to get there and he wants to stop the Christians from spreading this blasphemous heresy. And so Paul will have to ask for permission because in the Jewish tradition you have synagogues in different communities, and so Paul couldn't just show up and say, I'm in charge, I'm going to persecute the Christians. But the high priest in Jerusalem, if he gave him a letter saying, you have authority now in that Damascus community to try to capture the Christians, then that would make Saul have permission to go to Damascus. So he goes to the high priest, wants a letter for permission to kind of have an authority role in Damascus to help persecute the Christians, to capture them, imprison them, so that he can stop them from spreading this heresy. And so we're told in Acts chapter 9, verses 1 and 2, that's what Saul is doing. He's getting permission. So then we see that in that same verse 2, that he wants to go find all the Christians and bring them back to Jerusalem. His intention is to imprison them. He wants to arrest them and bring them back. And sometimes, like in Acts chapter 9, verse 2, you see that in most translations it says that he asked for letters to the synagogue at Damascus so that if he found any belonging to the way, men or women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem. That phrase, the way, was a common term used for the Christians at that point, because Jesus is the way and the truth and the life. So sometimes they refer to the Christians as the way. Sometimes they're referred to in the early church as the Nazareans, and then some refer to them as the Christians. The Romans will call them the followers of Christus. And so different people have different names for them, but if you see the way, that's what it's referring to, are the Christians. So then what we're going to see a little bit further down in Acts chapter 9 is something happens to Paul on his way to Damascus. And Paul is going to recount this event in several places. Several other times in Acts, Luke will tell us this version of this story again, and then in Corinthians and Galatians, Paul will personally give an account of what happens. And so in Acts chapter 9, verse 3, we're seeing that Saul is journeying on his way to Damascus, and then suddenly a light from heaven flashed about him, and he fell to the ground and heard a voice. So Paul has this encounter with Christ, and Christ tells him, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? And later on in Acts chapter 26, Luke is going to tell us that when this happened, it was middle of the day. Now, some people think that Paul was on a horse and then was knocked off. We really don't know. That was a tradition that developed many hundreds of years later when they started having paintings, and someone kind of painted Saul falling off a horse. We don't know that that's what happened. I've read some scholars, like when I was getting my master's degree in theology, one of my professors said that he thinks what was happening, because St. Luke was telling us it's the middle of the day, that because Paul was a devout Jew, that he was likely stopped and was standing in prayer facing Jerusalem, because that was a common time of the day for them to pray. And it'd be unusual for Luke to be telling us that detail in Acts chapter 26, that it was midday if it wasn't important. So it's possible that he was facing Jerusalem, standing in prayer, and then all of a sudden was knocked to the ground. But however it happened, he was knocked to the ground, and then he had this encounter with Christ. And so we see that Christ talks to him. We're going to come back to the words that were said here in just a second. But Christ talks to him and says, why do you persecute me? Paul says, who are you, Lord? And he says, I am Jesus whom you are persecuting. And so then Saul's immediately blinded. Physically. He's physically blinded, and he'll be blinded for 3 days. And then what we're told in this chapter is that he's blinded for 3 days, and then during this time he did not eat or drink. So why do you think Paul had lost his appetite? Over that period of time leading up to this moment, he had been systematically dismantling the Christians. And now he's realizing his zeal was misguided. He had been persecuting Christ, the Messiah, God. By persecuting these Christians, he'd been persecuting Christ. And it took Paul being physically blinded for him to see the truth. And so he's sickened, and you can imagine. So for 3 days he's not eating or drinking. So he realizes the number of people he had imprisoned and persecuted and even consented to being murdered. It meant that when he had consented to killing of Stephen, he's consenting to the killing of Christ. Because Christ is identifying himself with these Christians. He says, why are you persecuting me? Not why are you persecuting my disciples or my church, but me. So when he persecuted Stephen, he was persecuting Christ. When he persecuted all those men and women, he was persecuting Christ. So he was sickened. But during these 3 days, it's likely Paul also starts to realize everything he has heard Stephen and the apostles preaching, he can now see what they were saying is real. And being a faithful Jew, he would have known the Old Testament cold. He would have known it very, very well. So he's likely now putting 2 and 2 together. All the fulfillments of the prophets of the Old Testament, all those things prefiguring Christ, he now sees it and sees that the apostles and Stephen and the early Christians were preaching truth, and it's now all fitting together. So Paul realizes he had been fighting against God and not with God. So he now recognizes the Messiah had come. One of the key things about this phrase, whenever Jesus speaks to Saul and says, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? That's going to resonate with Paul the rest of his life. Because how many times in his writings do we see Paul talking about that Christ is the head and we are the body? It's this intimate relationship. And he'll talk about how though we are many, we are one body in Christ. Many times, Paul will use the phrase in Christ when he's writing. Just like in the Galatians we mentioned earlier, it's no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. There's this intimacy now because he recognizes in these words that when Christ has a relationship with his Christians, with his disciples, it's this intimate relationship. And so they become one with Christ. And so Paul is going to continue to write about this in his letters over time. And then what's going to happen is that Paul is going to be led to a man named Ananias. And this is towards the middle of chapter 9. So chapter 9, verse 10. Now there was a disciple at Damascus named Ananias. Now Ananias is a Christian. He's converted. He's a Christian. And Ananias knows Saul's reputation. He knows what Saul has been doing to Christians. So he is very afraid when he is first called by God to go find Saul. He's like, Saul? Are you kidding? That man who's killing everybody? I'm supposed to find him? But he's reassured by God that yes, that is what you're supposed to do. And so he goes and he finds Saul, and he discovers that Saul is blind and that Saul has had this encounter with Christ. And so Ananias lays hands on Saul, and he's immediately cured, and he can now see. And then immediately, what happens? He's baptized. And then the suggestion is that Paul has had such a deep conversion, because what happens next? If you look at, so in Acts chapter 9, verse 18 and 19, he rose and is baptized, and he goes and eats food, finally. But then immediately after that, verse 19 and 20, what does he do? He immediately gets up and goes out with the Christian disciples at Damascus and starts preaching in the synagogues that Jesus is the Son of God. So you can imagine the Christians are a little skeptical. So in chapter 9, verse 21, the Christians are a little skeptical. This man who is just dismantling us and killing us and persecuting us is now preaching what we've been teaching. He's now supporting us. So they're not sure at first, but then they eventually do see his conversion is genuine. And then the Jews think that he is their number one warrior. And now all of a sudden, there's been this change. So they're amazed and confounded at what's happening, because they also know Saul by his reputation. So we see this kind of change. Immediately after his conversion, he immediately goes out and starts preaching that Jesus is the Son of God. And so then we're told in verse 22 that Saul continued to increase all the more in his strength, and he continued to confound the Jews by proving that Jesus was the Christ. So now he's beginning to immediately evangelize the truth. And some of the things we're going to learn throughout Paul's letters, this message that he has for both the Christians as well as the Jews as well as the pagans. He's going to speak to all of them in his evangelization over the next several years. To the Jewish people, to his brothers and sisters, the Jews, he's going to show them that I now bring good news. The Messiah has come. That Messiah we've been waiting for has come, and it's Jesus Christ. And he has come and he has redeemed humanity. What we have been longing for and waiting for has happened, because St. Paul now realizes that's the truth. Now St. Paul also realizes that Israel, the Jewish people, God's covenant people, had failed in their mission. They were called to be a light to the world, but they hadn't been. Instead, they hadn't drawn others in. They'd actually excluded people. They had turned inwards and were focused more on themselves. There were many examples of how the Jews excluded the Gentiles and the pagans, and we'll see that in Paul's writings. But there's going to be this boundary, this separation, this wall that's put up between the Jews and Gentiles. And so Paul's going to show them we haven't been faithful to what we're called to do. And he's going to come and tell the Jewish people and the Gentiles, Jesus has come to bring the covenant to all people, Jews and Gentiles. Salvation is for all people. And Paul is also going to show us that he's not abandoning his Jewish faith. He sees that in Christ it's fulfilled. So everything that Jewish faith he had grown up in and been trained in, it's now all been fulfilled in Christ. We're going to see that Paul, in several places, including in Romans, but he's going to call himself a slave of Christ. He now sees that he is now a slave of Christ. And he's going to preach salvation for all. And that in Romans, a popular phrase is going to be he's calling all to an obedience of faith. So there's this faith and obedience that go hand in hand that he's calling us all to. And then he's going to confront the pagan world. Paul sees that there are seeds of truth to some degree in the pagan world, but he's going to call the pagans to come to the fullness of truth that's found in the Christian faith in Christ. And we're going to see that he is going to undermine the pagan worldview, and he's going to challenge everything they hold true. There's going to be things that Paul does that are incredibly bold and incredibly courageous in this pagan world. He's going to do and say many things that really are illegal because the Caesar of the empire had declared it to be illegal, but he's going to do it anyway because it's the truth. So an example, it was illegal to say anyone was God but Caesar. It was illegal to say anyone was the Son of God but Caesar. It was illegal to say anyone was the Savior of the world but Caesar. And how many times do we see Paul and the apostles saying this in their writings? Even to the Romans in Rome, Paul will say these things because he's bold, he's courageous. He knows that this is the truth and I'm going to preach it boldly in love and in charity, but I'm not going to be afraid because I want to challenge the pagans and be countercultural. Paul is also going to show us in many places that he's honored to suffer for Christ. And he knows that's a part of his mission is suffering. And he sees this, the more I suffer, the more I'm intimately uniting myself to Christ and what he did for us. And so he sees suffering as an act of love, united to what Christ did for us. Okay. Let's see. So after Paul's conversion, we're going to see in various places. In Acts, we're told this some, but also in other places, you kind of have to pick out exactly what happened these next 14 years from different areas, from Acts and Galatians and Philippians. But what we learn, after he's in Damascus, he spends about 3 years in Damascus and Arabia, these two areas, that we're not given any detail of what really happens. And then he goes to, he'll go to Jerusalem after 3 years to meet Peter and James. We're not really told if this is the first time or not, but we're told he goes to meet with them to discuss things. And then we're told he goes home to Tarsus. And he's there for 13 years. And again, we're not told any details of what's happening. But he's there for about 13 years. And then Barnabas will come and get him and bring him to Antioch. And they spend a year in Antioch, and then they go back to Jerusalem. And then in Jerusalem, they're going to meet with the pillars of the apostles, as St. Paul will call them, which is Peter, James, and John. And they're going to meet with them and talk with them. And then they're going to get their approval to go and evangelize. So the pillars of the apostles, Peter, James, and John, will give Paul and Barnabas their blessing. And then they're going to go out on their first missionary journey. And so they're going to go from Jerusalem to Antioch. And then we can see this happening in Acts chapter 13. They get the blessing from the pillars of the apostles and go to Antioch. And then we're told in the very beginning of Acts chapter 13 that the Holy Spirit even reveals to the disciples that Paul and Barnabas are to be set aside so that they can go on a mission. And then we're told that Paul and Barnabas, they fast and pray and then have hands laid upon them. So they're ordained. So this laying on of hands suggests an ordination. And then they go out to their first mission. So in Acts chapter 13 through 15, we're going to see the first missionary journey of St. Paul. And in your handouts, there are some maps. I'm going to show you the map here in a second, but you'll have it on the slides and in your handouts. But Acts chapters 13 to 15, we're going to talk about the first missionary journey. Now, we're going to be told they go to Cyprus first. But the first things to point out before we start talking about where they go is that they're going to go with Barnabas. It's going to be Paul, Barnabas, and Jean-Marc. Now, if we ask, well, why Cyprus? Why are they going to Cyprus? There's a few reasons. So first, Josephus. Josephus was a historian in the first century, and he tells us there were many Jewish people and many synagogues in Cyprus. So there's a big population of Jewish people in Cyprus. So that was one reason they probably go there. But there's something even more, most likely, that leads them to go to Cyprus first. Because Cyprus, as you'll see on the map, is a little island. So they're Barnabas. So Barnabas is with them, and Barnabas is from Cyprus. We're told in Acts chapter 4 that Barnabas is from Cyprus and that he had owned vineyards and fields in Cyprus. And when he had converted to becoming Christian, he sold them. To give money to the Christian community, but also because likely he didn't need them anymore. We're also told that Barnabas was a Levite, so he was from the priestly class of the Jewish people. And so Josephus also let us know on Cyprus were many vineyards where wine was made for Jewish feasts, particularly Yom Kippur, one of the highest feast days of the year. A lot of that wine was made from vineyards on Cyprus. So Barnabas probably had a lot of vineyards, but now he doesn't need them anymore. He's Christian, and now he has a different calling, so he sells his fields and vineyards. And we're told in Acts chapter 4, a lot of the Christians are selling their property to kind of raise money to help support the early community and to help support each other. So Barnabas is from Cyprus. He was a Levite of the Jewish faith, and Barnabas is leading this evangelization mission from what's suggested at first. So Barnabas probably is going to say, well, he probably still has family and friends there. Let's go and talk with my family and friends. Let's go tell them this great news we have about Jesus Christ. Now we're also told Jean-Marc goes with them. Jean-Marc is the same Mark who wrote the Gospel of Mark. Jean-Marc, we also learn about him in Acts chapter 12, that he was a Levite, which is the priestly class of the Jewish faith. And Mark also is probably wealthy because in Acts chapter 12, this is when Peter was in prison. And we're told that many of the disciples were at Mark's house. And he had a courtyard, he had a servant girl. And these are clues that he likely lived in a house that was assigned to someone with money, a family with money. So Jean-Marc may have been wealthy. He was definitely a Levite. And even more interestingly, in Colossians chapter 4, Paul will tell us that Jean-Marc is the cousin of Barnabas. So if Barnabas and Jean-Marc are going with St. Paul on this first missionary journey, they both have family and friends in Cyprus. So it sounds like a great place to start. They're going to be familiar with the area. They're going to have people they know, Jewish family members, who they're going to feel called to go and evangelize. And many of the early Christians that we'll see evangelize family and friends. Some of the first places they start is family and friends. Throughout the first 300 years, they will evangelize family and friends. So Barnabas and Jean-Marc are likely doing this. They're going to go to Cyprus and start there because they have family and friends there. Another interesting fact about Jean-Marc, Papias was a writer in 120 AD, and he tells us that Jean-Marc is also going to be the translator for St. Peter in Rome, and Jean-Marc knows Hebrew and Aramaic and Greek and Latin, so he's likely well educated. And many people even believe the Gospel of Mark are Mark's recordings of what Peter had said and done. And so it's almost kind of like this is Peter's gospel in many ways, because Mark does travel with Peter to Rome. So there's some clues that we learn from the get-go about starting with Cyprus, with Barnabas, Jean-Marc, and Paul. What we're going to see also is Jean-Marc is going to be with them in Cyprus, but then once they move on to another location, Jean-Marc will leave. We really don't know why. They don't give us any detail. Paul does not like it. He's not happy about it. He's very upset that Jean-Marc is abandoning their mission, but we are told Jean-Marc will leave. Oops. Let's see. Where is my map? All right. Now, you'll have the maps in your handout. The map is for some reason not coming up on here. And you can kind of follow along with the handouts for right now. It doesn't look like it's printing on this slide for some reason. So what we're going to see is they're going to go to Cyprus. And Cyprus is going to be this little island right off the coastline. And at Cyprus, they're going to meet, they're going to go to the synagogue first, then they're going to go and they're going to meet the governor of Cyprus. His name is Sergius Paulus. And we're going to see this in Acts chapter 13. We're going to see right around verse 7, we're going to meet the proconsul, which means governor of Cyprus. So to go to Cyprus, there's also going to be this magician who is with the governor. And I'm not sure how to say his name exactly, but Elimus Bar Yesu. And so he's going to be this magician. So I'm just going to call him the magician that's with the governor. Well, Sergius, the governor, hears about Paul and Barnabas and the preaching that they're doing, and he calls them over. He wants to hear what it is they're preaching and teaching. And so Sergius summons them over. But as Paul and Barnabas are trying to speak and interact with the governor, this magician, it says that he withstood them. So he's likely challenging them and challenging what it is they're preaching and teaching. And so Paul then addresses the magician, and he calls the magician the son of the devil. We can see that in verse 10. Verse 9 says, "But Saul, who is also called Paul, filled with the Holy Spirit, looked intently at the magician and said, 'You son of the devil, you enemy of all righteousness, full of all deceit and villainy.'" And so he's criticizing this magician because he's not being honest. He's being very deceitful. He's interfering with what God is trying to do. God is trying to, through Paul and Barnabas, reach out to this governor, and this magician is trying to withstand them and prevent that from happening. And then what Paul will do immediately after in verse 11 is he's going to blind the magician. He's going to work a miracle and blind him. In verse 11 it says, "And now behold, the hand of the Lord is upon you, and you shall be blind and unable to see the sun for a time." So it doesn't sound like it's permanent, but he blinds him. Well, when he blinds the man and makes him physically blind, this really impresses the governor. It suggests that he was probably already interested in what they had to say and preach, but now they've worked this miracle. And so now Sergius, the governor, is very impressed, and it says he believes. Now, one of the other things to note is this is the first time we see St. Luke calling Saul Paul. And St. Luke tells us, "But Saul, who is also called Paul." So now he's going to, from this point on, refer to him as Paul. And why does that change? Well, probably for a few reasons. One, they're now, for the first time, in a Roman place in a Roman colony, and so being in Roman territory, there's probably going to be a little bit more, they can kind of relate to the people a little bit better if they use their Roman names. But also Sergius Paulus shared his name with Paul. And so it might have been this little way of reaching out and kind of finding something in common. Oh, your name's Paul, my name's Paul too. And so this kind of dialogue that can happen, you can kind of break the ice and then start talking. So it's possible that this common name may have helped break down any barriers, and that might have been a reason. But definitely with Paul being his Roman name, then and being with a Roman audience is likely why they start using Paul at this point. And from here on out, he's going to be in Roman colonies and Roman territories for most of the time. So he's going to be called Paul from here on. So now what we're going to see is in Acts chapter 13, verse 13. And different translations may say slightly different things, but in verse 13 it says, "Now Paul and his company set sail," which is an interesting phrase. First, it suggests that Paul is now in charge, because before we really weren't sure, was it Barnabas? Barnabas is older. He had been a disciple a lot longer, and there were suggestions Barnabas is in charge, but now all of a sudden it's Paul and his company. So it suggested Paul now is in charge. But also, why is it a company of people now? It was just Barnabas and Jean-Marc and Paul and maybe a few others, maybe Titus and a few others, but they didn't make it sound like it was this huge group. Now all of a sudden it's Paul and his company, like it's this big group of people. So we're going to answer that question in just a minute. We can look to see where they go, and that may help us figure out who this company of people is that's with him. So we're told they're going to set sail from Paphos and come to Perga and Pamphylia, and they're eventually going to end up in Presidio Antioch. And so on your maps you can see Antioch. It's called either Antioch or Presidio Antioch. It's different than the Antioch that's north of Jerusalem. It's a different one. This one's in Asia Minor. Okay, and so they come to Presidio Antioch. Now this is a really long journey. You can see from Cyprus all the way up to Presidio Antioch. That's a fairly long journey. So why do they go here? Okay, so we can go back to that question about why is it now Paul and his company of people. So Paul's with a company. They go to a particular place called Presidio Antioch. Now what has been discovered by archaeologists is that the city of Presidio Antioch, it was a Roman colony, and they have discovered there was a huge estate owned by a man named Sergius Paulus. And so it's likely that this is his hometown, the governor of Cyprus. And it shows that the archaeologists say it was a huge estate, so he's likely really wealthy, probably the most important person in town, especially considering he's a governor now in Cyprus. And so what is suggested is that Sergius Paulus is now converted, and now he wants Paul and these Christians to go to his family and friends in Presidio Antioch and share this good news with them, share this new faith with the people there. And then this company of people is likely Sergius Paulus's friends, because he is now sending this stranger, Paul, to his hometown. He needs to have people that are witnesses and that can say, yes, this Sergius Paulus is sending these people. They're basically verbal recommendations. Go with my friends so they can give your recommendation from me to my family and friends. And so it's the group, the company that's with him is likely Sergius Paulus's friends or family, people that were with him to now support Paul and take them to Presidio Antioch. And so this is the point when Jean-Marc is going to leave. And so now it's primarily Paul and Barnabas and this company of people. And so we're told that when they get to Presidio Antioch, this is in Acts chapter 13, verse 16, 13, verse 16. When they first arrive, they're going to go and preach in the synagogues. And we're told they're going to address the Jews, the men of Israel. And then we're told they're going to address, different translations have different things, but either says, you that fear God, or God-fearers, probably says something along those lines. So there's two groups of people in the synagogue. So it's important to know who these groups are. So the Jews, straightforward. The God-fearers are Gentile people who believe in Judaism, but they haven't completely gone fully converted. They haven't been circumcised. So they haven't fully converted, they haven't been circumcised, but they go and they listen to the preaching in the synagogues and they're faithful to Judaism, but they haven't quite done everything required. So they're called God-fearers, or those that fear God, but they're pagan converts to Judaism. So we're going to see these two groups often in the writings, the Jews and the God-fearers that Paul will preach to in the synagogues. And the other important point is that synagogues were places of preaching and learning. It was very different than the temple. The temple was only in Jerusalem. That's where the priests would offer their sacrifices. That's where the Jews would go and make pilgrimages to for the feasts throughout the year. But synagogues were local in local communities and for preaching and teaching. And both Gentiles and Jews could be present. So these Gentile converts to Judaism could be present. Now, Gentiles, if they weren't circumcised, they weren't fully Jews, so they could not preach, they couldn't lead anything, but they could listen and they could be present. Now, in the temple in Jerusalem, it was different. Even those who were Gentiles but were believers, if they weren't circumcised, there was a wall where they couldn't go any further. So in the temple, you would have the Holy of Holies, which is where the Ark of the Covenant had been. Only the high priest could enter that once a year. Then you would have like the holy place, which is where the sacrifices were made by the priests. So that was for the priests. Then you would have the area for the Jewish people, those who were circumcised. And then you would have the outer courtyard for those who are not circumcised. So there was kind of this dividing wall. Gentiles and Jews were separated in the temple in Jerusalem physically, but in the synagogues they would interact and they could be in the same place. It's just uncircumcised Gentiles could not preach in the synagogue. And that will be important in a little while. So we're going to see everywhere that Paul goes, he's going to try to find synagogues first, but depending on their response, will determine what he does next. But here he preaches in the synagogue, and we're told that he addresses both these groups of people, and he's going to tell them the story of Israel. He's going to talk about Abraham and David, and Jesus is the new David. And then the people want to hear more. So when he leaves the synagogues, they follow him. They want to hear more. They're really fascinated with what's happening. Then Acts chapter 13, verse 44. I'm going to flip over to verse 44. We're told not only are the people following him, but the next Sabbath, so a week later, almost the whole city shows up to hear Paul preach. And so in 44, we're told the next Sabbath, almost the whole city gathered together to hear the word of God. And then in verse 45, we see a problem. But when the Jews saw the multitudes, they were filled with jealousy and contradicted what was spoken by Paul and reviled him. So from here on out, we're going to see this tension. Everywhere Paul goes, Jews are going to rise up and persecute Paul. And they're going to oppose what he's saying and what he's doing. And so here in Presidio Antioch, it begins. The Jews start to persecute Paul and Barnabas. They're going to incite, in some places, incite riots even, but here they're going to incite persecutions. They're going to threaten Paul and Barnabas, and ultimately Paul and Barnabas are driven out of the city. They have to leave. There's too much upheaval with what's going on, so they have to leave. And so we're told in verse 50 they were driven out by this persecution. And then in verse 51, but they shook off the dust from their feet and then went on to the town of Iconium. Okay. So we're going to go to Iconium next. You can see that on your map. And the context suggests it's just mainly Paul and Barnabas. It's back to that small traveling group again. It's not the big company, because Sergius Paulus's family and friends likely stayed behind in Presidio Antioch. So just saying the disciples. So it just seems like it's back to being the disciples and not the extra people. All right, let me see what time it is. All right. Well, let's stop for a minute. We're kind of at a stopping point at Acts chapter 14. Let's stop and take a break real quick. 5 minutes, and then we'll come back here in just a minute to continue talking on. It's about 5 minutes, so... All right, we're going to start back at Acts chapter 14. So as I mentioned, we see Paul going from Cyprus to Presidio Antioch, and then he's going to go to Iconium, which is where we left off, Acts chapter 14. And we're told in Iconium, he's going to go to the synagogues and preach. And there's going to be some converts. It says he's going to win some converts, both the Jews and the God-fearers. But they're going to also have persecutions as well. There are also going to be some Jews who rise up and kind of stir up the crowd to try to counter what Paul is saying. But we're told that they stay, and in verse 3, we're told they stay for a while and preach boldly, and they also perform signs and wonders. And so we're told, so likely they're working some miracles in this town of Iconium. And then we're told that the city is divided, basically the Jews versus those who are accepting what Paul is preaching. And so it comes to the point where, again, they're persecuted so much that they have to leave. There's this threat, they're threatened of being stoned, and so they leave. And they go to Lystra and Derbe. And so we can see those on the map as well, from Iconium to Lystra and Derbe. And he's going to be going back and forth a little bit between some of these towns. And Luke doesn't really give us any details as the arrows kind of go back and forth. We don't get any details, but he's going to be traveling between Iconium and Lystra and Derbe a few times, is what the text will suggest here in a minute. But he's going to go from Iconium to Lystra and Derbe. Now in Acts chapter 14, verse 8, we're going to see him entering Lystra. And we're told they meet a man who is crippled from birth. And this man listens to Paul, and he's very open and receptive. And so Paul sees his faith and cures him. And then the people who witness this are amazed. We're told that they are just in awe of Paul and Barnabas. And then in verse 12, we can see that they call Barnabas and Paul. And it depends on your translation. It's either going to say Zeus and Hermes, or it's going to say Jupiter and Mercury. Most scholars just believe they're the same thing. So Jupiter is the Roman name, and Zeus is the Greek name, but they're both gods, mythological gods. And then Mercury is the Roman name, and Hermes is the Greek name. And so they're referred to as Zeus and Hermes, these Greek gods, or Jupiter and Mercury, the Roman titles for the same gods. And the people call them that because they're in such awe with who these men are and what they're doing, and these miracles they're working. And Barnabas is older and he has a beard, and Zeus was the older of the gods, of the two gods, and had a beard, and so people kind of correlate that. Paul is also very articulate, and Hermes was known as being the spokesperson for Zeus. So they're thinking, oh, there's this older guy who's working miracles and this younger guy who's articulate. He must be Hermes speaking for Zeus. And so they kind of correlate this. Plus the town is very familiar with these gods. There's a temple to Zeus there, as well as other temples, but there's definitely a temple to Zeus, is what the scholars say. And then we're told that the pagan priests then want to offer a sacrifice to Zeus on behalf of what's happening. And so we're told that in verse 14, but when the apostles Barnabas and Paul heard of it, they tore their garments and rushed out among the multitudes, crying, "Men, why are you doing this?" So they see they're about to offer sacrifices to these pagan gods, and Paul and Barnabas become upset and tear their garments, and they tell the people that they should turn from these empty things to a living God. So I'm going to read verses 14 and 15 and then 18. So he says, they say, "Men, why are you doing this? We are also men of like nature with you, and we bring you good news, that you should turn from these vain things to a living God who made the heaven and the earth and the sea and all that is in them." And then verse 18, with these words, they scarcely restrain the people from offering sacrifices to them. And so now the people are almost wanting to offer sacrifices to Paul and Barnabas. They're like, no, you misunderstand. We come to preach the good news about God, the Creator, the one who has given us everything, different from these empty gods, these vain gods who aren't real. And so he's calling them to transform and to recognize that their sacrifices are vain and empty. They need to turn to the one true God. And this will be an important encounter to remember later on. So we are in Lystra, and this whole region is called Galatia. So the letter to the Galatians will be to these groups of people. It'll be important to remember this encounter when we talk about the letter to the Galatians later. So they work these miracles. They're called these gods. The people are just in awe and amazed. They'll do anything for Paul and Barnabas at this point. They are just absolute in awe. But in the midst of all this, we're told that Jews from Presidio Antioch and from Iconium come to this city, and they start to persecute Paul and Barnabas and the Christians, and they're going to persecute them so much they chase Paul and Barnabas out. And so these Jews from these other areas convince the local townspeople to make them leave. And then we're told Paul is stoned to the point that people think he's dead. And they take him out of the city and they leave him thinking he's dead. But then we're told Paul rises up and they leave for Derbe. Now, one of Paul's later letters, he'll even suggest, I thought I was dead. I mean, he was so badly beaten and stoned, he thought he was dead. So they leave him for dead, but then he's okay and he rises up. Now they go to the city of Derbe. And then we're told that they make disciples in this town. And then we're told they'll return to Lystra and Iconium and Antioch and kind of go around back and forth, strengthening the Christians that are present. And they're going to continue to strengthen them and prepare them for various persecutions that they're likely going to endure, particularly by the Jews, but eventually, potentially by the pagans. And so what we're going to see in Paul's first journey is they're going to establish local Christian communities wherever they go. They're going to appoint what the Acts of the Apostles will call either presbyters or elders, depending on your translation. Now, one of the things you'll notice is we don't hear the term priest. And most scholars believe it's because the Christians were already being confused as being a Jewish sect. So they wanted to differentiate themselves. They didn't want people to think the Christian priests do the same things as the Jewish priests, because we no longer need animal sacrifices. We no longer have to go to the temple. It's now different. And so it's likely that as long as they were still identified closely as being a Jewish sect, they kind of refrained from using that term priest, although we'll start to see it in the next less than 100 years. We'll start to see the terms priest being used, but they had to kind of help differentiate themselves first. So we'll see them referred to as either elders or presbyters, generally. And these are the leaders of the communities, and Paul will put presbyters, the elders, in all these locations to kind of help support the community when Paul can't be there. And then Paul will continue to build up these different communities. He'll kind of continue to call them to live radically. That being united to Christ, being a Christian, means to transform your life in every way. And so he'll call them to that. Now what we're going to see here, that's the end of his first missionary journey. And he's going to circle back through the towns and come back to Antioch, north of Jerusalem. And then what we're going to encounter, and we see this in Acts chapter 15, is that there's a problem that starts to happen. And all the early Christian communities were told, like we see in Acts chapter 15, verse 1, that there are these men from Judea who come and they start to cause a problem. Now these men from Judea, you're going to hear different terms being used for them. They'll either be called men from Judea, which means Christians from Jerusalem, or you'll hear them called Judaizers, or you'll hear them called the circumcision party. But what they are, it's Jewish converts to the Christian faith who are preaching that you have to be circumcised to be Christian. And they're going to cause this huge tension in the Christian communities. And it's going to be very disturbing. It's going to upset things so much that the apostles are going to have to gather together in Jerusalem and hold a council. So Luke tells us in chapter 15, verse 2, that Paul and Barnabas saw that there was no small dissension and debate with these people from Judea. So Luke doesn't give us any more detail, but what we're going to realize from Paul's letters, this is a major problem. It was causing a lot of division within the Christian church because there are arguments. The apostles were saying, some of the apostles even were not certain as to what they were to preach, possibly, because we see Peter and Paul have a little interaction, but ultimately they gather together and say, Peter stands up and says, you don't need to be circumcised. Paul and Barnabas will say you don't need to be circumcised. James will say you don't need to be circumcised. And so there's this sense there may be some confusion, but ultimately they're going to gather together in Jerusalem, have a council, they're going to speak, and it's going to become a definitive decision that no, you do not have to be circumcised to be Christian. And we're going to be told the Holy Spirit also kind of confirms these words. And then what's going to happen is they're going to send out a letter to all the different communities from this council, and you can see that in first of all, in chapter 15, verse 28, after everyone has talked and Peter's kind of made his definitive statement that no, the Gentiles are part of the covenant with God. Paul and Barnabas have confirmed their experiences. James rises up. Verse 28 is going to say, for it has seemed good to us and to the Holy Spirit that this is going to be our decision. And so we already see the Holy Spirit as an important guide for the church from the beginning. And so then we're going to see that They're going to make some disciplinary decisions as well about being careful for things that are sacrificed to idols, and being careful from those things that are strangled. It's going to not necessarily be something that Christians are bound to, but it's going to be for the sake of those people who aren't really sure. And we'll talk more about this when we talk about Romans. But the key thing with this letter is you do not have to be circumcised. And so we're told that they're going to take these letters to different communities. And then that's when Paul and Barnabas are going to stand up again to discuss their second missionary journey. And we're going to see the second missionary journey in Acts chapter 15, chapters 15 to chapter 18. That's all right. Now what we're going to see in verse 36, chapter 15, verse 36, they're wanting to go back to Galatia. They're wanting to go back to that first community where they had been on their first missionary trip, and so Paul and Barnabas talk about it. So let's go back to Galatia. Well, Barnabas wants Jean-Marc to come along. Paul does not want Jean-Marc to come along. Paul feels like he abandoned us the first time. I don't want to have him coming with us again. So Paul and Barnabas have a little bit of a dispute. And what ends up happening is Barnabas takes Jean-Marc and they go to Cyprus, and then Paul is going to take Silas, another disciple who we learned about, Silas, and they're going to go to Galatia. And so Paul and Barnabas are going to go on separate trips to go and evangelize these communities. So Paul will go with Silas. We're going to, on this second missionary journey, we're going to see that Timothy, Bishop Timothy, who will eventually become Bishop Timothy, Paul will write his letter to Timothy, his two letters. They're going to meet Timothy in Lystra and Derbe. We're going to see that Luke himself will join them in the city of Troas. We're going to talk about that. So those are some key points. Where's that map? The map's not coming up. Let me close it and open it again, because that's how the map came up last time. Because for some reason it's like making these pictures go away. Okay, so this is their second missionary journey. So Paul's going to take Silas. And Acts chapter 16 is where we'll start. Paul and Silas are going to come to the cities of Lystra and Derbe, and we're told here they meet Timothy, who's going to travel with them. And as I mentioned, he'll become Bishop Timothy eventually. But there's a suggestion that Timothy is recognized from the beginning of being a very good leader and a very strong preacher and evangelist. We're told that Timothy is now a Christian, but that he has a Jewish mother and a Greek Roman father. So he's a Greek father and a Jewish mother. And then we're told in chapter 16, verse 3, what happens? Paul wanted Timothy to accompany him, and he took Timothy and circumcised him. You're like, whoa, wait a minute. We just had this council of Jerusalem that said you didn't have to be circumcised. Why is Paul circumcising Timothy? And Paul is going to be the loudest, most outspoken that you don't have to be circumcised. So what's happening? Well, this isn't about circumcision and the necessity for salvation at all. What's happening is that Paul is making a pastoral decision, because what he recognizes is that circumcision is no longer required for salvation. It's not required to be a Christian, but circumcision is required in order to preach in synagogues. And Timothy, being a Jew, could preach in the synagogues, but he's not circumcised, so he couldn't. So Paul says, I'm going to have you circumcised so I can utilize that and allow you to preach. And being both Greek and Jew, you're going to be able to influence both groups, both those who were the God-fearers as well as the Jews, as well as even pagans, because you have that relationship to all these groups. And so Paul will have Timothy circumcised. It's for a pastoral reason, kind of a strategy of how I'm going to evangelize these communities and use Timothy and his gifts to do that. And so he's going to circumcise him. So he has him circumcised, and as part of the Jewish faith because he had one parent Jew. That was possible. We're going to see with Titus isn't circumcised because he doesn't have a Jewish parent. So Titus can't be circumcised, but the fact that Timothy could be, he's going to utilize that. So then we're told in 16 verse 6, after they're in Lystra and Derbe and that area, Iconium and Antioch, Paul's going to have a vision that tells him to go west. So he's going to go west to the city of Troas, which is also the city of Troy, the popular city of Troy. So Paul is going to obey this vision and listen to this vision and go west. So go to Troy. And Paul does this, and then he'll leave from Troy or Troas, and he's going to go off to Greece, Macedonia, that area. And then we see the other important thing in chapter 16, verse 11, or actually verse 10, even before verse 10 and on, the pronouns are now going to change. Luke had been writing them and they did this, and they went with them, but now it's going to be we and us, because Luke joins them in the city of Troas. So Luke now joins them, and so from here on out you'll see the different pronouns, we and us, being included because Luke is with them. So Luke now will be an eyewitness to everything that's happening. And then chapter 16, verse 12, we're going to see they go to the city of Philippi. You can see it on the map, just north up there. And this will be the same city that he'll write his letter to the Philippians later on, many years later. But this is the city of Philippi. It will be important as we talk about this city to learn about these people in this community, because it makes it a little easier when you're reading the letter to the Philippians to kind of be able to say, oh yeah, I remember that community and what they did and the experiences there. He'll write his letter to them many years later, probably when he was in prison in Rome, but he will write back to this community. But Philippi was a leading city in Greece. It was a Roman colony. It was a center of economic trade. One of the things you'll notice with Paul is a lot of these communities where he goes are important Roman colonies also. And so they're important Roman colonies, plus they're going to have roads to and from them, and all the surrounding cities will have good roads established, so it makes Paul's travels easier, but more importantly, the spread of the gospel is even enhanced because he can utilize the structure that the Roman Empire has put in place for starting off with this key city, and then the message can spread from there to some of the surrounding cities a little bit easier. So he'll go to some of the key cities in this area of the Roman Empire. And so like Philippi and Corinth, Presidio Antioch, Ephesus, those are all very important cities. And so Philippi is a center of economic trade, and it was strategically located between the land and the sea, and so they had many visitors, many people would pass through there. It also would have had a Roman governor. There would have been worship of the emperor as a god, as well as having many of the pagan gods being worshipped in this city, because it was a Roman colony. All citizens of this city would have been exempt from taxes. Most Roman citizens kind of held that title with pride. So if you're a Roman citizen, it's like, I'm a Roman citizen, I'm special. There's this special thing that comes along with being a Roman citizen, this kind of nationalistic pride to some degree. And so people in Philippi would have dressed like Romans, spoken like Romans, act like Romans, had a lot of those cultural influences in that city. And so Paul is going to challenge them, because in his letter, he's going to say, you are called to be citizens of heaven. He's going to call them to this higher citizenship. And so that's why some of these things are important. The way Paul will speak to them will kind of address some of those cultural things they have. But here in Philippi, we're going to see that in verse 13, he's going to go down to a river. Well, why does he go to a river? Well, because in Philippi, there was no synagogue. And so if there had been any Jews or God-fearers there, in order to pray on the Sabbath, they would have needed to find a source of water because they had purification rituals, and so they would have been down by the river. So Paul goes down by the river to look for any of the Jews or the God-fearers to see who he could find. And we're told that he meets several women, and we're told that one of them is a woman named Lydia, and it's suggested that she's a businesswoman because we're told that she is a seller of purple goods. Purple was a status symbol signifying wealth. So it's likely she was also selling to wealthy clients, and she probably had a fairly successful business. But we meet Lydia. We're told that Lydia is a God-fearer. So she's not a Jew, but she's definitely is a follower of Judaism. We're told that she converts to Christianity and that her and her entire household are baptized. And so that's an important thing you'll sometimes see throughout these journeys of Paul, is that a lot of times when people convert, it's not just them, it's their entire household. And so they're really evangelizing multiple people when they do this. This is also one of the supports that we can give for infant baptism. We're not told there's infants in all these different households, but it wouldn't be surprising or unlikely. Most of the time, of all the different households we see that are baptized, most of them, or at least some of them, would have had children. And so children and infants, that's one kind of indirect way of potentially arguing for infant baptism. There's a lot of other pieces of evidence in the New Testament besides that, but that's one clue. But then we're shown a really cool story in Acts chapter 16, verse 16. So we're told that Paul and Silas are traveling through the city of Philippi, and they're followed around by this slave girl. And this slave girl, we're told, is possessed by a demon. And we're told it's a spirit of divination, which means that she was possessed, but this demon gave her the gift of being able to give prophecies. Okay, so she's able to prophesy, but she has this demon. But she is just following Paul and Silas everywhere. It tells us for days she's following them. And she's shouting out everywhere they go, "These are the servants of the Most High God, who proclaim to you the way of salvation." So she's saying this over and over and over. Finally, we're told that Paul and them are frustrated and fed up with this girl. Everywhere they go, she's following them. So then Paul finally expels the demon from her. He performs an exorcism, and the demon leaves her. And we're told, oh, that's probably a good thing, right? Well, it probably is, but her owners are furious because she had been a source of profits for them. Because she was able to prophesy things, they had been able to make a profit out of that. So because she had been able to make all these different prophecies, her owners were kind of using her for that gift. Even though it was a demon that possessed her, they didn't really care. They were making money. So when Paul and them exorcise the demon, they're upset. And so we can see in verse 18, Paul was annoyed, and so he turned and exorcised her. And the demon left her. And verse 19, but when her owners saw their hope of gain was gone, they seized Paul and Silas and dragged them into the marketplace before the rulers. Because we're told her owners are furious and they're mad at Paul and Silas because now their source of profit is gone. And so Paul and Silas are accused of disturbing the city. And different translations may have different things, but in verse 20, we're told they tell the town leaders, "These men are Jews and they are disturbing our city." Well, what that suggests, disturbing the city, is a phrase that would mean riots. And it was illegal to riot in the Roman Empire. Because the Roman Empire was so vast, the emperors made a law that you cannot riot because they didn't want anything that would cause instability. So it was illegal to riot in the streets at all, no matter who you were, whether you're a Roman citizen or not. You couldn't riot. So it was illegal. So they're accusing them of rioting and saying they're rioting in the city. And then we're told also in verse 21, they advocate customs which it is not lawful for us Romans to accept or practice. Now, we're not told any more about what that is, but we will be able to see in many places, particularly in Paul's letter to the Philippians, Paul's letter to the Romans and others, that most likely, because they were preaching there is only one true God, that Jesus is God, Jesus is the Son of God, Jesus is the Savior, Jesus is the Prince of Peace. All these titles were supposed to be for the emperor alone, and anyone claiming them would be arrested. It was illegal. And so Paul and them are probably boldly preaching these things, and so they're saying they're advocating things that are not lawful for us to do. Plus, they're probably telling the people in Philippi, you can't worship the emperor, and you can't worship these pagan gods. That's not right. It's vain, it's empty. Worship the one true God. And so they're accusing Paul of all these different things. And so then we're told that Paul and Silas are beaten, and then they're put in prison. And then we're told in prison, so around verse 25, in prison, it's nighttime. They're singing hymns and giving praise to God. And then all of a sudden there's an earthquake. And then their shackles are opened. And then we're told that the prison guard all of a sudden is about to kill himself because of this. So we're like, what? Because it says, verse 27, when the jailer woke and saw the prison doors were open, he drew his sword and was about to kill himself, supposing the prisoners had escaped. As a prison guard, a Roman prison guard, it was your duty to do your job. And if you failed, the punishment often was execution. You would have been killed. So this Roman prison guard would rather kill himself than be publicly humiliated. So he's about to kill himself because he thinks the prisoners have escaped. And he wanted to avoid the death penalty and humiliation from that. But then we're told in verse 28 that Paul cries out with a loud voice, "Do not harm yourself, we are all still here." And so the prison guard called for the lights and rushed in, and he was fearful, and he falls at the feet of Paul and Silas. And we're told in verse 30 that the prison guard immediately says, "Men, what must I do to be saved?" So to me it's a little fascinating. How is it that all of a sudden this prison guard is ready to convert? There was an earthquake and the shackles open, the prison doors open, but is that enough to really make someone convert because Paul and them didn't run away? Well, it is, if you recall. Number one, they were miraculously freed by this earthquake and didn't run away. They were singing hymns of praise to God, which maybe the earthquake was a response to that. But number three, what had the prison guard and everyone else in that town heard for the past several days, maybe even weeks, however long it's been, from that demon, that possessed demon girl who was able to give prophecy? She had proclaimed time and time again, "These are the servants of the Most High God, who proclaim to you the way of salvation." Now all of a sudden he's having heard this girl who gave prophecies. These men were singing praises to this God. Now all of a sudden an earthquake happens and they're freed, but they don't run away. This prison guard is convinced there is something special about these Christians. So he immediately wants to convert. What must I do to be saved? And then they tell him in verse 31, believe in the Lord Jesus and you will be saved, you and your household. And then they're going to eventually baptize him and his family. And so then the rest of this passage is going to tell us that the next day, this is around verse 35, the next day the town magistrates, the leaders, they come to Paul and Silas and want to just simply free them and then tell them leave the city. We'll free you, but leave the city. And Paul is upset. He's like, no, we're not going to do that. You publicly beat us and imprisoned us as if we were doing something wrong, and now you want to secretly free us and tell us to leave town? No. So Paul speaks up and says, Silas and I are Roman citizens, and now you have beat us. And that's illegal. It's illegal to beat a Roman citizen without trial. You cannot punish a Roman citizen without a trial. So Paul now uses this against them. Why didn't Paul speak up the day before? We don't know. But now he's going to use it against them. They beat them without trial. And so now he's going to say, you beat us without being on trial, without giving us a proper trial. We want you to publicly apologize and publicly tell everyone that you're letting us go. And so it's likely he was doing this for the Christians. He didn't want to leave his Christians in the dark of the night or secretly, and also to let the Christians know, be strong in your faith, be bold, be courageous, don't give in. Look what's happened to us, and things will all work out. I mean, he's probably giving the Christians a message through this as well. And so they will publicly let him go. So he'll publicly be freed, and then they will leave the city. Now, when you read the letter to the Philippians, as I mentioned, it'll be many years later, and it's probably when Paul was in prison in Rome, probably in the early 60s, probably 60 to 62 AD, probably. And he's going to encourage this community. We're going to learn that at that point in time, this community is very strong in their Christian faith by Paul's letter, and they're full of love. He's going to encourage them to remain humble, to remain in love. And he's going to call them to remain in humility, obedience, and love. Those will be the key messages for these people. But this is really going to be a community that's close to his heart. You can tell his letter to the Philippians is very beautiful, very poetic in certain points. But he loves this community, and they're very, very strong in their faith. Now in Acts chapter 17, after Philippi, Paul's going to go to Thessalonica. Thessalonica is a big port city. And we're told in Acts 17, verse 2, that he's going to go to the synagogues. He's going to argue there for about 3 weeks, using the Old Testament to prove that it was necessary for Christ to suffer and die and rise from the dead. Because that's one thing that was really hard for the Jews to understand, is that if the Messiah comes, but if you're saying Jesus is the Messiah suffered and died. This Messiah was supposed to vindicate us and free us and be our king and get us out of this persecution. But the Messiah, Jesus, didn't do that. And so they're very baffled. And so Paul is showing them how it is that it was necessary for Christ to suffer and die. And so we can see that in verse 3, explaining and proving it was necessary for Christ to suffer and rise from the dead. And then we're told that some are convinced, but then a group of Jewish people become jealous. They gather people together to create a riot, and then they blame this riot on Paul. Then we're told that, verse 5, they attack the house of Jason. Jason was one of the Christians who was housing Paul. Paul and them were staying at this man's house. So these Jewish people attack Jason, and they take him to the town leaders. So in verse 6, and when they could not find them, meaning Paul and Silas, the Jewish people dragged Jason and some of the other brethren before the city authorities, crying, "These men who have turned the world upside down have come here also." And so you can already see how radical Paul's message must be. They're already talking about how Paul and them are turning the world upside down. They're being countercultural. They're challenging both the Jews and the pagans to come to the fullness of truth. So they're challenging everything they know to be true. So being very countercultural. So we see that right away. And so they're going to blame everything on Paul and what they're doing. And so as I mentioned earlier, they're going to be preaching that there's another king besides Caesar. Caesar may be king, but there's a greater king, the King of Kings, and that's Jesus. This was illegal to do, but it's likely they were doing it anyway. And as I mentioned earlier, they'll be proclaiming Jesus as the Savior and the bringer of the peace, which were titles that were supposed to be exclusive to the emperor, Caesar. Whenever they say Jesus is equal to God, and in Paul's letter to the Philippians, he will say Jesus who is equal to God, so it's likely he's preaching this also. Being equal to God was only something for the Caesar, for the emperor. So again, we can see Paul is really being radical and challenging what they held to be true. And so they're going to have taken Jason. While they take Jason and the others, Paul and Silas, we're told, will secretly leave town and go to Berea, because they just see that what they're doing in Thessalonica is not being successful. So we're going to go to a town called Berea, and we're told in verse 10, chapter 17, verse 10, in Berea they again preach, and many Jews believe. And we're told it's because they can see that what Paul and the others are teaching is the fulfillment of the Scriptures, which is our Old Testament. So it's a fulfillment of the Old Testament. But while they're here, there's also some Jews who eventually try to run them out. And so what happens is the disciples convince Paul to leave. They're going to stay behind and kind of go back and forth between Thessalonica and Berea. It's like Silas and Timothy will stay, and they'll continue to preach to those in Thessalonica and Berea, but they're going to convince Paul to leave. He doesn't want to, but they know that for his safety and for the interests of evangelization, they're going to have Paul leave. So they convince Paul to leave, and so Paul's going to go to Athens. But we're told that Timothy is going to keep Paul informed of what's happening. And so Paul's going to go to Athens. So in verse 16, we see Paul in Athens. In Athens, there are many, many, many Roman temples. And Paul is going to actually become angry because he sees so many of these temples to these pagan gods. And we're told that Paul, while he's in Athens, is going to have debates with the Jews in the synagogues. And he's also going to meet these pagan philosophers in the marketplace, and he's going to debate with them as well. And then we're told around verse 22 that Paul is going to give a speech at the Areopagus. And it's a beautiful speech that we're not going to read, but it's beautiful. I definitely encourage you to read it. But he's going to talk to the men of Athens. He's going to challenge what they know. And he's going to tell them, I found this altar that you labeled to an unknown God. Well, I have come to preach to you about this God. And this is the one true God, the creator of the heavens and the earth. This is the one true God, the living God. And he's going to call them to forget these pagan gods, these vain gods, these empty gods, come to the one true living God and worship him. So he's going to give that speech of the Areopagus there in Athens. And just for time's sake, we're not going to read it now, but it is something I encourage you to read. So we're going to move on to chapter 18. So after Athens, Paul's going to go to Corinth. Now, one of the things we do think is that while he's in Athens, he probably writes the first letter to the Thessalonians. So he had been in Thessalonica, then went to Berea. There's a lot of persecutions, and he went to Athens. While in Athens, he likely wrote the first letter to the Thessalonians, to that community, because he couldn't be there with him, so he's going to write to encourage them. And in that letter, he's going to emphasize, stay hopeful, don't lose hope. He's going to encourage, say, you have great love, you have great faith, but he's worried that they're losing hope. So he encourages them throughout that first letter to the Thessalonians, don't lose hope. And so he's going to encourage them and build them up through that letter. Okay, so now from Athens to Corinth, he's going to go to Corinth in chapter 18. Corinth is a very large city. It's 3 times the size of Athens. It's also a Roman colony. We're going to see at the very beginning in verse 2 that Paul is going to meet these Christians by the name of Priscilla and Aquila. They're Jewish Christians. They're now in Corinth. But we're told they had been in Rome for a time, but now they're here. And what we know from history is that the Emperor Claudius, sometime in the early 50s, he was the emperor of the Roman Empire. He did, at one point, expel all the Jews from Rome. Well, why did he do that? Well, because what had started to happen were the Jews were having fights among themselves over some man named Christus. That's what the Romans would call him. So the Jews are fighting among themselves among this Christus. The Emperor Claudius doesn't want riots because it's a threat to peace and stability. So he's like, all the Jewish people out of Rome, you're gone. He expels them all because he's hoping to kind of break up the riots and the disputes by just separating them and letting them go back on to some other place, kind of disperse to kind of break the tension. Now the Gentile Christians, they'll stay in Rome because they're not Jews. The Romans thought the Christians were Jew, but they weren't really sure who these Christians were. They thought they were a Jewish sect. So Claudius will expel the Jews, so all the Jews would leave. Now the Gentile Christians will stay, and then the Jewish Christians will have to leave. And then eventually, when the Emperor Nero takes over, he'll let everyone back in for a while. So for a while, it's okay in Rome with Nero, but it doesn't last. But then Claudius will expel them. So this Priscilla and Aquila had been in Rome, and we're actually going to learn later, they probably knew Peter from some things that happened. But Priscilla and Aquila had been in Rome, and now they've been expelled, so they come to Corinth. And now they're in Corinth preaching and evangelizing the Corinthians. So Paul's going to meet them. Paul's going to also learn they're also tent makers. So they have a similar trade. They're all tent makers, and so Paul has something in common with Priscilla and Aquila, so they'll all stay together while they're in Corinth. And then we're told that every Sabbath, Paul will go to the synagogues and he'll debate. We're also told that Silas and Timothy will eventually come and reconnect with Paul here in Corinth. And so we're told this will happen for a time, and then eventually, we're told in verse 8, Crispus, who's a leader of one of the Jewish synagogues, is going to convert to Christianity. And then we're told Paul will stay in Corinth for about 18 months. And throughout this time, the Jews do persecute them. And so eventually, it will get to the point where Paul and Priscilla and Aquila will all leave. We also meet in verse 17, just very briefly, this man named Sosthenes. It says, and they all seized Sosthenes, the ruler of the synagogue, and beat him. Well, why did they do this? Luke doesn't tell us, but in Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, he greets Sosthenes. So it suggests he's a convert. So this Jewish synagogue leader, Sosthenes, likely also converts to Christianity. And because he does that, the Jewish people beat him and persecute him. So we see 2 Jewish synagogue leaders, Crispus and Sosthenes, converting. And so then the group is going to leave. We're told they go to Ephesus. And then in Ephesus, you can see on here, it's on the coast of Asia Minor. It was a large, thriving city. Now nearby, which is not on this map, but not too far from Ephesus, is Colossae, which is going to be Paul's letter to the Colossians. Paul never goes to Colossae himself, but he will write them a letter. But Paul goes to Ephesus, and then he spends a time there. It's brief. We're not really given much information. And then he'll go back home. He'll go back to Caesarea and then Jerusalem. And so that ends the second journey. So now we're going to move on to the third journey. I'm going to reopen this. don't know why it's doing this every time. It's a lot more helpful to have the map, so let me just make sure we get it. Okay. And this is just a picture to show you. Oh, it didn't come up there. Well, I'm not going to. I don't want to lose my map. All right. So Paul's third missionary journey. We're going to see this at the beginning of, towards the end of chapter 18. Okay, so the end of chapter 18. Because Luke goes straight on. They basically go home for a time. It doesn't really tell us how long. And then they're going to set out again on their third missionary journey. In Acts chapter 18, around verse 24, before we start talking about their third journey, he's going to also mention a man named Apollos. Let's see, so on the map you can see they're going to go for their third journey and go from Antioch. He'll pass through his hometown. He'll go back to Galatia and spend a time there. Luke doesn't give us much information. And then he'll go to Ephesus. And Luke is going to really give us most of the information about what happens in Ephesus. And so that's where Acts chapter 18, verse 24 is going to start off. And then chapter 19 will continue that they're going to be in Ephesus for a time. And we're going to talk about what happens. Well, we're told when they get to Ephesus, they're going to meet a Jew named Apollos. In verse 24, he's a Christian. He's converted. He's a Jewish Christian. We're told that Apollos is an eloquent speaker. He's well versed in Scripture. And he's very fervent. But we're told he needs more catechesis. So Priscilla and Aquila go and they help improve Apollos in his knowledge. And then what's going to happen is Apollos is then going to be sent to Corinth because Paul wants him to go on ahead of them and continue to build up that community in Corinth. If you recall, and we're going to read this on Thursday, the first letter to the Corinthians, one of the first things Paul is going to talk about is there's this dispute among the Corinthians, and they're going to have these divisions because some people say, well, I'm from Apollos. Some will say, I'm from Paul. Some will say, I am from Cephas, which is Peter. So they're going to have these divisions over which kind of leader they're associating with. Well, Apollos is here. He's that leader. He's sent over to preach and evangelize by Paul. So he's supposedly very eloquent and very knowledgeable. So he likely really kind of encourages a lot of people. He gets a little fan club, basically. And so you have Paul with his fan club and Apollos with his fan club, and then Peter will have interacted with these people through Priscilla and Aquila, likely. So Paul's going to get on to them saying, it's not about us. We are only the people who water. It's God who gives the growth. And so Paul is going to kind of rebuke them and say, don't have these divisions. We are just the messengers. We're just Christ's instruments. It's Christ that counts. So that's just kind of a little side note. We're going to meet Apollos here, and then we'll hear of him later. Now in chapter 19, verse 1, that's going to start this discussion about what happens in Ephesus. We're told that Paul will speak in the synagogues and that he's here for 3 months, and then he'll change locations in Ephesus and be there for about 2 years. And we're told that many miracles happen while he's here. And we're told that many do convert. And it's likely while he's in Ephesus during these 2 years that he writes his first letter to the Corinthians. And so now we can understand he's probably getting word that there's all these divisions about Apollos and Paul and Peter, and there's other problems in Corinthians that we'll talk about in Corinth. And so Paul's going to, the scholars debate over times and dates, but most likely he writes his letter from here to the Corinthians. Well, the interesting thing about Ephesus, which is important when we read the letter to the Ephesians later, in chapter 19, verse 19, we're going to see the culture of Ephesus. Ephesus is full of people who are practicing the magic arts, kind of the occult, the popular culture, these magic arts, this magic cult, this black magic in a sense. And there's also going to be a big group of people who worship the pagan gods. So we're going to see both these groups. But in verse 19, we're told, and a number of those who practiced magic arts brought their books and burned them in the sight of all. And they counted the value of them and found it came to 50,000 pieces of silver. So basically what they're saying is these people who had been practicing these magic arts are now convinced and converted by St. Paul that they burn their books. It's a sign that they're leaving that old practice and they're now converting to Christ. And so Ephesus was known for these magic arts. And whenever you read the letter to the Ephesians, there's this hint. There's this constant reminder of this spiritual warfare, this battle that's ongoing, because there's this underlying culture of these magic arts. And then we also see that there's a lot of people who worship the Greek god Artemis. And that's in like verse 24. You're going to see that there are many shrines of Artemis. So there's many people who worship this god. Well, what's going to happen is many people are going to be convinced by Paul. They're going to stop practicing this pagan worship, and we're going to see that is going to cause a major problem. In verse 24, one of the silversmiths, his name is Demetrius, he becomes very angry because now that he has all these people stopping this worship of these pagan gods, his silversmith job of making these idols and these statues is now being affected. So he's not making as much money because he's having these people leave and go worship the Christian God. And so he's angry. And so verse 23, 24, we see that the silversmith, who's Demetrius, his business is being affected by what's happening. And he says, men, you know that through this business we have our wealth. And he's going to go on about how these Christians are now drawing people away from this practice into the Christian faith. So he's going to protest, and Demetrius is going to gather other silversmiths in the area, and they're going to riot. They're going to be outraged, and so they're trying to cause this big riot, this big kind of persecution of the Christians. But then we're told towards the end of chapter 19 that one of their leaders stands up. This is towards the very end. One of their leaders stands up and says, let's stop this, let's not cause a riot over this. And then in chapter 20, verse 1, we're told that after the uproar, Paul sent for the disciples, and then they leave. So there's going to be this big kind of rioting that takes place. The silversmiths especially are going to be involved. They're going to stop the riot so it doesn't escalate too far, but it gets bad enough that Paul and them decide to leave. So it's time for them to leave. And we're told they're going to go to Macedonia, which again, they're going to go through the city of Troy, and go across to Macedonia. And it's likely, again, some of these dates are debated, but it's likely that he'll write his second letter to the Corinthians at this point. He's going to travel through this area of Macedonia, going back to some of the places he had been previously. He's going to encourage the Christians, and he's going to stay for about 3 months, is what we're told. And then in chapter 20, verse 3, we're told, he spent 3 months, so that's verse 3. And then we're told a plot was made against his life by the Jews. So Paul realizes that his life is now being threatened, that there's this plot to kill him. So he's going to change his mind of the route he's going to take for the rest of his journey. And so he's going to kind of reroute his trip. And then we're told he'll go back to Troy, the city of Troy, and he'll stay there for 7 days. This is around verse 9. Then we're going to see that, if you remember that poor Eutychus who is listening to Paul's preaching going on and on and on and on and on, he falls out of the window because he falls asleep, falls out of the window and dies. And then Paul will go down and bring him back to life and then get up and continue preaching. So that little scene with Paul and Eutychus happens in chapter 20, verse 7. So Paul is preaching, and then they stay there in Troas for 7 days, and then they're going to leave. And then Luke doesn't give us a lot of details for much of this trip, but they're going to leave that point and go to the city of Miletus. You can see it just south of Ephesus. This is around chapter 20, verse 15. And we're told that Paul wanted to visit Ephesus, but he doesn't have time. He wants to try to make it back to Jerusalem for Pentecost, and so he's trying to kind of expedite his trip. So what he does is go to Miletus, and then he's going to call the leaders from the church in Ephesus to come to him. He's going to say, meet me in Miletus. So in verse 17, we see the elders of the church are called, and Paul is going to meet them and talk with them, and he's going to have that interaction there instead of having to go all the way to Ephesus, just save him a little bit of time. And he'll suggest in several places that it's because he wants to get to Jerusalem for Pentecost. And so they're going to meet him, and he's going to give a speech. Now, it's debated as to when he wrote the letter to the Ephesus. Dr. Tim Gray thought is at this moment that he writes the letter to the Ephesians after he's met with the leaders and he's starting to travel back to Jerusalem on his way to Pentecost, that he wrote his letter to the Ephesians, because there's some terms in Ephesus that suggest the Pentecost and the Holy Spirit and some of these things that make him think that it might have been at this point. But there's a lot of debate. Some scholars think it was several years later, whenever Paul was in prison in Rome. I think there's a lot of good evidence to suggest it happened at this point, but you're kind of free to believe whichever. But it's possible he wrote the letter to the Ephesians at this point versus many years later when he's in prison. Now we're told he's in Miletus, and then he travels to Caesarea. So chapter 21, verse 8, around this area. He's going to travel to Caesarea, which is just north. It's on the shore, on the sea, by kind of northwest of Jerusalem. And then we're told that when he's in Caesarea, he stays with Deacon Philip and his family. And then we're told while he's there, a prophet tells them all that Paul will be handed over to the Romans by the Jews while he's in Jerusalem. So the disciples try to persuade Paul not to go. Don't go to Jerusalem. You're going to be captured. But Paul tells them it's the will of the Lord that he go there. So in chapter 21, verse 12 to 14. So verse 12. When we heard this, we and the people there begged him to not go to Jerusalem. Then Paul answered, "What are you doing, weeping and breaking my heart? For I am ready not only to be imprisoned, but even to die at Jerusalem for the name of the Lord Jesus." And when he would not be persuaded, we ceased and said, "The will of the Lord be done." And you can see Luke including we. So Luke was one of these ones encouraging Paul, don't go, don't go. But Paul is determined, he's ready to die for the Lord, if that's what it takes. And so they sent it and said, "The will of the Lord be done." So Paul will then travel to Jerusalem. He's first going to meet with the apostles. In verse 17, we're told he meets with the apostles. And then we're told the days after arriving in Jerusalem, around verse 27, about a week later, Paul is in the temple, and many Jews are stirred up, and they stir up the crowd because Paul is there. And Paul already has a reputation now of being a bold Christian. And so they're angry that he's teaching things opposed to Jewish law. So we're told that they grab Paul and beat him. So you can see in verse 27, they stir up the crowd, they lay hands on him, they're going to cry out that Paul is teaching things opposed to the Jewish law. They'll grab Paul and beat him. This fighting is broken up by the Roman soldiers, and then Paul is imprisoned because the soldiers don't know what's happening. They just see these fights and riots going on, they see the men that seem to be the key people, and Paul seems to be the center of it all. And so they arrest Paul until they can figure out what's going on. They can see, as we're told in this section, they can see that Paul seems to be the source of animosity. So to kind of break up the riots, they just arrest Paul and take him away. And then Paul will kind of preach to the Jews briefly, but then he's going to go on trial. And so we can skip to Acts chapter 3 just for the sake of time. Throughout chapter 22, 23, 24, through the end of Luke, you're going to see many times where Paul is going to give his conversion story. And so it's beautiful to read this because he has different emphasis and he has different details and information each time. But it's really beautiful to see what Paul's saying and preaching. So I encourage you to read those sections. But for time's sake, we're not going to read those. We're going to go to Acts chapter 23 because Paul is going to go on trial. And the Jews are going to try to explain to the Romans why it is they must arrest Paul and charge him, and then Paul will give a defense for himself. And then eventually what we'll see happening is in Jerusalem they can't really figure out what the deal is. They don't really understand why Paul is such is causing such animosity. They're going to send him to Caesarea, where the governor is. The Roman governor is in Caesarea. So they're going to send Paul there because they can't decide in Jerusalem what to do with Paul, so they're going to send him to the governor. And then we're told that the governor, in chapters 23 and 24, the governor is the governor Felix. And Paul is going to appeal to the governor. He's going to give him his testimony. And so you can see kind of the middle part of chapter 23, verse 23. He's going to come before the governor. And then in chapter 24, at the very beginning, he's going to give his defense. So he's going to explain who he is and why what he's doing, what he's preaching, and he's going to give his testimony to Felix, the governor. And then we're told towards the end of chapter 24 that he is in Caesarea for 2 years, and he's questioned several times as they're trying to figure out why there's such animosity and if Paul has done anything wrong. And then we're told in chapter 25, verse 1, that Felix is succeeded by another governor. After 2 years, Felix is no longer governor, and now Festus is governor. And so Festus will hear about Paul, and the Jews are going to start to kind of brown-nose Festus a little bit and say, we need you to take care of this Paul. So Festus goes to talk with Paul, and it tells us that he wants to do the Jews a favor. So Festus kind of sees some advantages of maybe giving the Jews what they want. So he goes and he tries to hear what Paul has to say. And Paul will talk to Festus, and Festus ends up wanting to send Paul back to Jerusalem, because that seems to be what the Jews want. So Festus wants to kind of do them a favor and send them back. But then Paul realizes that and protests. And Paul says, no, I want to appeal to Caesar. And as a Roman citizen, he had that right. And if he appeals to Caesar, the governor can't deny that request. So instead of returning to Jerusalem, Paul doesn't want to do that. Paul wants to appeal to Caesar. So now Festus has to send him to Caesar. This is around verse 11. And so he says, I appeal to Caesar. Now before leaving, Paul is going to give his testimony again. We're going to see he gives his testimony to the governor Festus, and the King Agrippa is also going to be present. And he makes a really good account, strong account for what's happening, even to the point where they say, man, if he hadn't appealed to Caesar, we would even let him go. But he'd already appealed to Caesar, so they were going to go ahead and send him to Rome. And so at this point, we're told he will set sail for Rome. Acts chapter 27, the very beginning. And it's not an easy journey. They encounter many storms. They're shipwrecked. And we're almost finished, just a couple more minutes. They're shipwrecked. We're told in Acts chapter 28, I guess it's Acts chapter 27, they're shipwrecked on the island of Malta. Paul will work many miracles there, but then they'll eventually set sail for Rome in Acts chapter 28. Paul arrives in Rome, and Luke ends with him preaching to the Jews and Gentiles in Rome. And then Luke tells us Paul is there for about 2 years. And then tradition tells us that Paul was imprisoned in Rome from probably around 60 to 62 AD, and then he's released. Tradition tells us he likely set sail from Rome to Spain, stayed there for a short time, and then went back to Rome. And then when he returned to Rome, he would eventually be captured and martyred by Nero, this Emperor Nero, sometime between the years 64 and 68. Scholars kind of debate as to exactly when it was, but the mid-60s AD is when Paul was killed by the decrees of Emperor Caesar. And so that ends Paul's journeys. And so it'll be important as we start to talk about Paul's letters to kind of recall these different communities and the experiences he had and who these people were. I know to me, like once I realized the connections you can make, they're simple, but when you read the letter to the Philippians, you read it a little bit differently now, knowing Lydia was from Philippi, and the prisoner, that prison guard, the Philippian jailer, the possessed demon girl was there, and you can kind of see some of the things those Christians were experiencing, plus all the persecutions that happen in all these different cities, and you can kind of read those letters a little bit in a different way. And so over the next 2 days, on Wednesday and Thursday, first on Wednesday we're going to cover Galatians and Romans and salvation. And then on Thursday, we're going to cover Ephesians and first letter of Corinthians and Paul's teachings on the church. And so we're going to kind of go through those things just a little bit. Not a ton of depth just because of time, but we'll go into as much depth as we can during our time. And so we'll continue Wednesday. One of the things that I would encourage you to do would be either to go back and read some of the things that we've kind of gone through today in Acts to kind of refresh yourself of what's happened on these 3 journeys again. Or you may want to prepare for Wednesday and read maybe the first 3 chapters of Romans, and Galatians isn't very long. If you can read the whole thing, great, but if not, maybe the first few chapters of Galatians, just to start to introduce yourself to what we're going to talk about on Wednesday with Romans and Galatians. So either one. As for the intermediate life people who want the credit, they do require some reading, so try to do one of those if you're trying to get the certificate. But for everyone else, I would encourage you to read it. Either what we covered today or the first 3-4 chapters of Romans and Galatians to at least get introduced to what we're going to talk about Wednesday. Okay?